Hello and welcome to Wrong Place, Wrong Crime. This is our season finale for season 1, where we focused on the yogurt shop murders. In this episode, we will look back on how law enforcement finally linked Kenneth Allen McDuff to the murders of Colleen Reed and Melissa Ann Northrup. We'll also give my opinion on why this case is still unsolved. Now, McDuff made 2 mistakes that essentially got him caught. First mistake that he made was getting spotted by the witnesses leading out of the car wash with Colleen Reed in the tan Ford Thunderbird. He picked the wrong girl that night. Colleen Reed was a fighter. She fought back and she screamed. That scream would eventually lead to Kenneth Allen McDuff's downfall, because that scream brought attention to that car wash from the 4 witnesses on the front porch. And without those 4 witnesses, this is a case that could have very easily gone unsolved. You have to remember, this is 1991. Not cameras on every corner that picked up his car leaving the car wash. And so without the idea of this vehicle by the 4 witnesses, there was no physical evidence left behind. This case could have very easily gone unsolved. Colleen Reed case, in fact, the first 3 months had all the earmarks of the yogurt shop. Very little physical evidence, and there were no suspects. The difference in the yogurt shop and Colleen Reed was the tan Ford Thunderbird and the witnesses. And that would not have come about or come into play if Colleen Reed would not have screamed that night and drawn attention to the car wash. That tan Ford Thunderbird would not really even come into play until March. And even though it had been described by the witnesses there that night at the end of December 29th, law enforcement hadn't had any luck finding or spotting that tan Ford Thunderbird. Of course, we know that local law enforcement was not going to have any luck because it was 100 miles north in the Waco area. The tan Ford Thunderbird only came into play because, as we know from the last episode, it was abandoned by Kenneth Allen McDuff on the night that he kidnapped Melissa Ann Northrup. Remember, he had left it in the hotel parking lot next to the Quick Pack there in Waco, and law enforcement would find it a number of days later after it was reported that it had been parked in the parking lot and had been left there. That's how the tan Ford Thunderbird came back into play. So his second mistake was leaving the Thunderbird there in the parking lot of the hotel next to the Quick Pack. Remember, the car had broken down that night. He really didn't have any choice to leave it there that night, but it was quite surprising that he didn't have somebody come and move it, or for him to sneak back and try to get that car away from the convenience store. The tan Ford Thunderbird, he had left, remember, his ID in the car. If he doesn't leave the Thunderbird in the parking lot, law enforcement probably never has an idea that Kenneth Allen McDuff was involved in the Quick Pack kidnapping. The only link that they had to him was that Thunderbird that was found first couple of days after the kidnapping. They had no idea, or they had no suspect until that ID was found in the car. Now, as we know, McDuff, because he got on law enforcement's radar because of the car being found, he now becomes the number 1 suspect in Melissa Ann Northrup's kidnapping. And of course, word gets back to Austin PD that there's been a tan Ford Thunderbird found, and so he becomes the number 1 suspect in the Colleen Reed kidnapping. We know, as I've discussed, that he was captured in Kansas City. Remember, McDuff didn't come back to Central Texas or the Austin area. He knew that he was in trouble in both areas. McDuff was always smart enough to know when he was a possible suspect in an area, or when he was in trouble in an area, and he would leave that area and not come back. That's why he left the Austin area after the Colleen Reed kidnapping. He knew that that was not a clean crime. He had allowed Colleen Reed to scream and had drawn attention to himself. And the car leaving the parking lot possibly was spotted by people. And so he left the Austin area. He didn't come back to the Waco area in risk of being captured because, again, he had left his vehicle and his ID around the crime scene. He knew better than that. He unfortunately was a seasoned, experienced criminal. And so he took off from the entire state. He was later captured in Kansas City in early May. He was spotted on America's Most Wanted. He's brought back to Texas. And Texas has to make a decision about which case do they believe that they can get a guilty verdict. Of course, McDuff refuses to admit guilt. Either case is not an easy case to prove. They're not slam dunk cases by any means. In the Colleen Reed case, they have no body. They only have 4 witnesses that were there on that front porch trying to identify a car as it raced away. And they have Alva Hank Worley. Now, in the state of Texas, in order for a co-defendant to testify against another, there has to be evidence that shows what he or she is testifying is true according to the evidence. So that was always difficult to prove, that someone who's testifying, his evidence or her evidence has to link up in order for them to be found credible. So it was not going to be an easy case. There's no physical evidence at all. Not an easy case to prove. We go then to Melissa Ann Northrup. Again, if it wasn't for the car and the vehicle, no witnesses there at the crime scene. He doesn't use an accomplice for this crime, which is one of the few that he didn't. Again, this was an unplanned attack or kidnapping. He hadn't traveled. This was only done because his car had broken down right beside the quick pack, and he knew Melissa would be working the graveyard shift. He did have a couple of people spot him leaving in Melissa's car, and what they believed was Kenneth Allen McDuff with Melissa in the car there along the route. Again, not an easy case to prove. Luckily, you did have the car next to the quick pack with the ID in it. And that was the main piece of evidence that would eventually get him found guilty in the Melissa Ann Northrup case. They did decide to go with that case first because they did have a body. They did have her car. They had found some hairs that were linked back to Kenneth Allen McDuff. They went with the Melissa Ann Northrup case, and he was found guilty. And he is again given the death penalty. In the Austin area, Travis County DA decides to prosecute also McDuff for Colleen Reed. Now, Colleen Reed, again, a lot harder case to prove because there's no body. You did have the 4 witnesses on the porch, and you had Alva Hank Worley. And because of those, he was found guilty in that case. So Kenneth Allen McDuff is on death row. He begins to talk about some of the crimes to an informant. He gives the informant a map to where one of the bodies is, and he describes it. That victim was Regina Moore. After Regina Moore's body is found, they press McDuff to try lead them to Colleen Reed. He describes where body should be. They go and try to find it, and they have no luck. That's when under heavy guard, they take Kenneth Allen McDuff to the site, and he does help them find Colleen Reed's body. When they get to the day of Kenneth Allen McDuff's execution, on this day, Kenneth Allen McDuff, he does confess to the yogurt shop murder. Now, most people believe that he confessed because he thought that would get him a stay of his execution, because people would want to know how he had done it. He was looking for any way to try to stay alive. So some people don't believe that this confession was true. We'll leave that up to you to decide that. When I first started looking at this case a number of years ago and really started studying it, I always came back to the question, why hasn't this case been solved? Why wasn't Kenneth McDuff a suspect earlier on, before the month of March, and before he was linked to the two other murders in the area? And the more I thought about it, I had to realize that 1991 was a different time period, different world over 35 years ago. They didn't have internet. They didn't have cell phones. The police, and I want to make sure everybody understands, I am a huge supporter of police. I love law enforcement. I'm a big supporter of law enforcement. So this case, I believe, goes back to poor communication. It really does. Kind of what I've talked about in a couple of other episodes. You have to remember, they have just a couple of investigators working on this case. Now, they have help from DPS and other agencies, but they have thousands of tips coming in, and every one of those tips and leads that they have coming in, they have to be investigated. So you have all the people that are working this case trying to track down these leads and these tips, and it sends them on a lot of times to wild goose chases on things that didn't have anything to do with the actual crime. The part that I always, again, have to remember was, and it's the same thing that you saw, there's a reason why Ted Bundy committed crimes in different areas of the state and not at where he usually lived, because he wanted to make law enforcement have to communicate with one another. And I really think that goes back to why McDuff didn't get on anybody's radar earlier. We know that we've seen how evil Kenneth McDuff was in this podcast, and he's definitely in the area, or close enough to the area, where he should have been one of the very first people, in my opinion, investigated. Somebody's got to communicate and say, hey, state of Texas, we have released a guy known as the Broomstick Killer. He's now living in the Waco area. We might want to go and take a look at him and see where he was at the night of these murders. And for one reason or another, I don't know. Again, a ton of it probably had to do with leads coming in and tips coming in and having to track down all of these different aspects of these tips and these leads, and taken away from your investigators and the people that they really probably should have been looking at. They had billboards everywhere. They had tips coming in from these numbers and these suspects. There were a lot of suspects early on, a lot of suspects that they were trying to track down. We know that obviously the young men that were later arrested, one of them was actually brought in 2 weeks afterwards and was questioned and was released. And so I really believe law enforcement was trying to do their best, but unfortunately, it was not communicated that he was a serial killer. There was a serial killer in the area. He had killed going all the way back to 1966, and he had been paroled, and he's 100 miles away. And we know that he had been in the Austin area at some point in October and November. For one reason or another, he didn't get on APD's radar. Not anything I found from my research, and I don't believe from what I've seen or read that Kenneth Allen McDuff was known or even thought of by Austin PD until March, when they spotted or found that ID in that 10 Ford Thunderbird dealing with the Melissa Ann Northrup kidnapping. When I also started looking at this case, and again, I'm not a big conspiracy person, but I always had in the back of my mind, were there people that really were hoping that it wasn't Kenneth Allen McDuff? Could there have been pressure put on people from higher ups, parts of the government that didn't want this case to come back to Kenneth Allen McDuff? You ask yourself, well, why would people want it not to be Kenneth Allen McDuff? Well, think about it. That's a terrible look. Imagine how mad people in the state of Texas would have been if Kenneth Allen McDuff had been found guilty or been person responsible for the Overchop murders. They've released a serial killer back. The only person that's ever been on death row twice, and they released him back onto the streets, and he ended up murdering these 4 girls. The outrage of the people of Texas, they were outraged even when Colleen Reed and Melissa Ann Northrup cases were linked back to Kenneth Allen McDuff. That's the type of thing that can change the way a state's run. That's the type of thing that can change elections, can change seats of power. When people get that upset, which they were going to be if it was Kenneth Allen McDuff that would have been responsible for the Overchop murders. Well, I've always wondered if there were people within the state, the higher up parts of the government, that were hoping that it wasn't Kenneth McDuff. Because if it would have been Kenneth McDuff, you can only imagine the outrage and the outcry that would have come from the people of Texas, and really even the entire nation, over a total lack of our criminal justice system here in Texas, and the power and the corruption that's set into motion with our parole board letting Kenneth Allen McDuff out of prison. Again, I'll let you take that into account, let you decipher that, think about that. But again, we've talked about it. There was very little physical evidence left by Kenneth Allen McDuff. Between the fire and the water at the crime scene, very little physical evidence. It's going to be a very hard case to prove anyway. And as we've talked about, I really all believe that this case is ever going to be solved because of advancements in DNA. It's now gone on too long, unless you get a miracle and or an accomplice or somebody coming forward on their deathbed or in prison and they confess to being a part of the crime or being there that night. Short of a confession, the only way I believe that we're ever going to solve this case is through DNA. And again, 1991, not a lot known about DNA. Kenneth Allen McDuff didn't understand DNA or know about DNA. He knew about hair samples and fingerprints, but there was DNA left at this crime scene. And that will hopefully be the one thing that can help solve this case in the future. I hope you've enjoyed Wrong Place, Wrong Crime podcast. I know I've enjoyed this podcast, doing it and presenting it to y'all and getting you the information about the Overchop murders and Kenneth Allen McDuff and the possible connection with this crime. I would hope you'd like and subscribe. And you're saying, well, this is the season finale. Yes, it is the season finale, but there is going to be a season 2. And so if you like and subscribe, you will get a notification when season 2 comes out. Season 2 will be studying and we'll be looking over the Kentucky Fried Chicken murders in Kilgore, Texas in 1983. So if you know anything about that, look forward to studying that and learning more about that crime. Again, it's another case where there is a suspect that still has not been captured. But we will, in season 2, dive into the KFC murders in Wrong Place, Wrong Crime.